Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, plenty of problems surrounding Maryland primary elections. Will this be a precursor for the general election in November? The death of George Floyd should have been a moment of unified outrage, and then something else happened. Stay tuned. Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by former County Council member Mike Knapp, Maryland National Republican Committee woman Nicolee Ambrose, political strategist Susan Heltemes, and the Dean of Democratic Politics, Sam Statland. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. Has nothing changed in America since the death of Freddie Gray 5 years ago? Last week, the video images of George Floyd were so viscerally shocking that all of America was saddened. Yet, in these terrible, divisive times, America didn't have time to heal, to internalize and place into context the full repercussions from Floyd's death, because the country was immediately challenged by protests that turned violent, destructive, and even murderous. Susan, Floyd's death revived the feeling among many that law enforcement is endemically racist. Is that the problem?
There is a problem that has been pretty much acknowledged by law enforcement officials across the country, that there has been a historic precedent that police can be very, very, very nasty when it comes to treating African Americans, and it certainly was the case here. The irony of the Minneapolis case is that the police chief is African American, but there is such an inborn structure in the department, from what I've heard from people and friends and everything in Minnesota, that Minneapolis has a long ways to go. And what has protected police officers in the past is the head of their police union, not affiliated with the AFL-CIO, I must say, and union officials across the country and Minnesota are saying he has to go. But the irony is he goes beyond protecting his officers, and he was even at one of President Trump's rallies. And they're saying that kind of overt political action should not be the case.
Well,
it's there, and their work. Anyway, it will be interesting to see if it changes. The police chief is challenged, and I'm not certain he's going to be there for a long time.
Well, the question is whether not just the Minneapolis police, I mean, the national protests and the international protests that have been sparked by this is questioning the whole entire police structure as being racist in America. I want to go to Nicolee on this now. So, Nicolee, Basketball Hall of Famer Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote that the Black community is used to institutional racism inherent in education, the justice system, and jobs. And even though we do all of the conventional things to raise public and political awareness, the needle hardly budges. Is that the case?
Well, that's a great question, because we have to question how much the needle has moved on the streets of Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered. And all of us, the whole nation, saw George Floyd murdered on those streets. And we all acknowledge it was despicable. Derek Chauvin was a bad apple and should have been removed from the police force years ago. He had 18 previous complaints, including a death. So why was he allowed to continue to operate? And we have to look at what the reality is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It is a solid blue city that elects Democrats. There is a Democrat county prosecutor. One of those prosecutors has been the very Amy Klobuchar, who's in the United States Senate. And the state is also run by Democrats. So people need to ask, why can there not be competition? Why are people allowed to operate like this? Because clearly bad apples have been existing there, terrorizing certain folks for well over 2 decades, just like Derek Chauvin.
I think it's
So I
very
completely
fair.
understand.
I
that justice is sought.
appreciate the comments, but these protests that we've seen and Mr. Floyd's death touched a chord with people, not just in Minnesota. I admit, last week, I thought after Mr. Floyd's death, it would be a localized story. It would be localized to Minnesota, and that it would be one more tragedy, because the statistics don't show that there is inherent racism in police forces. But all of a sudden, this became a national issue and an international issue. So what are we looking at? And Mike, I want to ask you specifically about the poignancy of Floyd's death. It inspired so many to take to the streets, but at some point, from denouncing the senseless murder and denouncing the senseless actions of this police officer, the marches turned violent. Why did they?
Well, I think the reality is that you haven't changed many of the underlying issues. And so this is an element of a police officer who's gone rogue and done something. But the reality is that if that were a white person, it would not have happened. And so I think when you're sitting there looking at a place like Minneapolis, but looking across the country where you're seeing disparities in economics, disparities in education, disparities in housing between blacks and whites, and then you have this situation, the frustration is palpable. That doesn't excuse the violence, but I think you have to now look and say, once we had that initial spate of violence, step back and look across the country and look across the globe and see how many peaceful protests and demonstrations of people of all races that are taking place. And so I agree, there was that initial outburst of violence, but now we've stepped back and people are recognizing and addressing what you articulated, which is a moment to address the broader issue. And people are starting to do that through broader protests that are peaceful. I mean, when you look at frustration like this, I think you've seen this in the black community, and you see this looking at the white community. I mean, why did white people show up at the Michigan State House with weapons? Because they wanted someone to pay attention and listen to them. And so, unfortunately, we take bad steps to try and get people to pay attention and listen to them, and the frustration is that palpable. I think that's what happened, but we're moving to a point now where that discussion, that discourse is now getting more broadly disseminated, and we're having that discussion that we should be having, not focusing on the violence.
Well, I want to pick up on something that you just said, and that was that that Floyd's death wouldn't have occurred if he was white. It would only occur because he was black. And I don't want to play lawyer here, but unfortunately I am one. and I know that, when you see the little video snippets from the different cell phone images that have been released, at some point Floyd did resist arrest. You see him handcuffed. You see him put in the car. At some point, he resisted arrest and was out of the car, and there was a struggle. So this is what I think many people are trying to grasp and put into context is, why did this guy end up on the ground, and why did he end up with two police officers, at least on his body, holding him down, and the one with his knee on the neck. The videos were shocking. That's why I asked. That's why I want to ask.
That hold is not allowed in Minnesota, first of all, because it is a deadly hold. So you can say what you want about.
We're going to find out. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, Susan.
That is the
I guess
fact.
There's going to be a prosecution. The man's been charged with murder too. The three other officers have also been charged. So when the trial comes, we're going to find out what happens. But let me remind you, when Freddie Gray died 5 years ago, those police officers were all charged as well, and the outcome was very different. They were not found guilty.
Well, I might have there with the young black man.
So what we see on video doesn't always necessarily know what's going to happen in the courtroom. I'm sorry, Sam. Sam, repeat.
I said, Casey, what we saw on television is a perfect example of even what happened in the Gray case, and that is that discrimination within the police force starts from the top down. It goes to the training of the officers, who trains the officers, how they're trained, and a little bit of use of common sense. Yes, the guy, maybe he committed a crime. He was pulled out of the car. He was held down. But there is such a thing as excess force, and that's what you saw. And what that does, though, Casey, is amongst many people in our community, thank God within the United States, it shows that we're tired of taking this type of treatment to any of our citizens.
Sam, but the question is, you say that all our citizens, there are 300,000 arrests each year in the United States. Not all of them turn violent. Not all of them turn into a situation where the police take someone's life. The police are necessary. The police are necessary for maintaining law and order.
The problem.
Well, but I think that's a really interesting point that you raised, and the issue that we have
one
is,
at a time. Guys, we got to go one at a time on this format.
Yeah.
So Sam, make your point. Susan, I'll get to you, and then Mike.
You got a call on me if you raise your hand. Look, Casey, what happens is that even in Montgomery County, you go to the district line up George Avenue, Connecticut Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue. Minorities are pulled over 30% more than white people. When you look at sentencing in crimes, people are held up. You know, the minorities get tougher sentences. Some people go to jail, white folks don't go to jail. It's discrimination. It's blatant discrimination. It's been going on for a long, long time. And it's intrinsic to the new morality of what racism is. We've moved.
Sam, I think I don't know if I agree with you, but I want to give Susan time to answer.
Okay,
and then Mike.
I want to say that this also goes to the court system, because there was a violent shooting in St. Paul of an African-American man in his car, and he was shot by the police. And that police officer was found innocent when it was taped even. But they have one prosecution that is making the news in Minneapolis, and that was when a black police officer shot a white woman. And there is a lot of angst about that in Minnesota. And so we have to look at the court system also in terms of racism.
Because minorities are sentenced to longer periods of time for the same crime.
Sam, I don't know if I'd like to know where you're getting your statistics from and what's
very simple. Getting it a valid website called Ben & Jerry's. And if you go to Ben & Jerry's website, they have a whole column, I'm serious about this, that talks about the new kind of racism that we have in this country. That goes back to what Mike says, equality of education. Gee, wasn't there this thing?
I want to go to Mike. We've got about a minute left. Mike,
I'm
got to
good.
go to Mike. Sam, Mike.
No, I think the challenge is that what we're teaching our police to do is to be not necessarily law enforcers, but we're teaching them to be assertive and aggressive and to actually be more proactive on the streets. I mean, to have images of police officers now with weapons forcefully advancing on peaceful protesters, that's not what their job is to do. We need our police officers to be there to make our communities safe and secure, and to be our reinforcements, our resource, not necessarily be someone who is out there coming after us. And unfortunately, we've trained them to how to shoot, how to attack. We haven't necessarily trained them as how to intervene.
Mike, I don't know if that's a fair statement. I mean, police reform has been going on for the past 20 years.
Well,
I mean,
we need to get better at it.
Two black attorney generals, and it's been 12 years since Barack Obama was elected. You don't think there's been better policing that has been instituted since the year 2000? I mean, come on.
Better is a relative term. If you start in a really bad place, now you're better.
I want to go to Nicolee on this.
I think what you two just hit upon is a key distinction that most people aren't recognizing, which is these problems are very regional. There are certain parts of America that handle this very well, and there are a few, whether it's an individual bad apple like Derek Chauvin, or there are a few cities who just don't have a lot of pressure and are maybe not training officers how we'd expect. But I think it is limited, and I think it's very regional. So if you're on the bad side of it, it very much depends where you live.
Well, I might say that Montgomery County police are accused of the same thing. I don't know of a police department, and I spent some time this week talking to a couple of different police captains around the country. And I think this is pretty systemic around the whole country. As a country, we have a lot to go, and I would urge everybody to go to the James Corden interview with Congresswoman Valdema, who is the former Orlando police chief. She succinctly said, plus a whole lot more
Susan,
of what Mike just said, and it sums up the issue.
I don't think our police forces are racist. I think there may be some issues that have to be addressed, but the statistics do not support the conclusion that all police forces are racist. They just don't support it. Nationwide or in this jurisdiction of Maryland and Montgomery County. Fortunately, I'm taking the last word. When we come back from this short break, there was an election last Tuesday. How satisfying was it for you? Stay tuned when we come back from this short break. Welcome back. The Maryland primary election, which was delayed by the COVID-19 virus and was conducted this past Tuesday, and it was done primarily by mail-in ballots, proved very unsatisfying. Here in Montgomery County, there were long lines at the 5 in-person polling stations where many were forced to go because voters did not receive their mail-in ballots in time. Nicolee, what was your experience in Baltimore?
So I mailed my ballot as soon as I got it. I got it 2 weeks later than we were initially planning to, although we knew Baltimore City would be one of the last 2 jurisdictions. Didn't get it till the week before Memorial Day, sent it, and I still don't believe they have me as a recorded vote. I kept getting messages from the systems that seemed to know whether or not you had voted, that I hadn't voted, so I'm a little concerned. You know, all of our ballots had a little scan ID on it, so it's a really easy thing to track. And here in Baltimore, they're only reporting that 49% of the vote has been counted. And yesterday, for a moment, they even just completely zeroed out all the tallies. So
260,000
there's a conflict here.
ballots have come in so far. 260,000 in Montgomery County. These votes, absentee, are going to go until Friday, a week before they're finally counted. So there's no way that you can tell whether or not your vote was actually received or not. This process is ongoing every day till they get caught up. But the problem is, and this goes back several elections, but the same issue is the poor supervision of Linda Lamone and the State Board of Elections in dealing with vendors where they flat out don't follow up to make sure that the ballots are delivered in time. And the second, on time or mailed on time. And the second thing is you would have thought somebody would have done a lot of public relations telling people to make sure that the Board of Elections had their proper address, because these ballots were mailed out to the address on file. And we saw very, very little telling people that if they want to get a ballot, they got to make sure their address is correct on file. And that goes back again to the leadership of Linda Lamone, who I think should go. And it's also my understanding that we will, if the Senate can ever figure out how to meet, legislation is going to be introduced abolishing the Linda Lamone for Life law, which is way beyond its time.
So, Mike, when you take all this into consideration, what level of confidence should the electorate have in mail-in elections, and whether or not we're going to try to repeat this fiasco in November?
Well, I think generally we should have a high degree of confidence in mail-in elections. I think the challenge you have in Maryland is you're responding to a pandemic, and you have a situation that they weren't actually trying to figure out how to do. It wasn't a systemic approach. I don't disagree with Sam's challenge from a management perspective. Obviously, that has to be addressed. But I think in states where you look at where it's been more systemic and people identified this was the direction they wanted to head, places like Colorado and Utah, we see very high levels of satisfaction, high turnout, high participation, and I think it's important for us to see that. And so I think we're going to see this get worked out, and so I think the elections in the fall are going to be fine, and I think people should have a high degree of confidence. One of the things I'm really intrigued by is the discussion lately is that looking at how Republicans seem to be opposed to kind of the efficiencies that are out there as we do better voting by mail, and then getting greater voter turnout. I'm just don't understand why we wouldn't want to get as many people to vote as possible, and yet somehow mail-in ballots seem to be something the Republicans are opposed to, and I just don't understand that. Why not having more people?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll
Correct.
tell you one reason. I mean, I saw a picture. I don't know if it was in the Post or the Gaithersburg Gazette, but I saw somebody going up to the official drop-off box, and they had a big U.S. mail carton carrier there, and they were just shoveling in ballots. So I guess it's the harvesting ballots issue that has people concerned as to how fair and free the election is.
But you see, the majority of Republicans across the country want mail-in ballots.
No.
And the
Wait a
other
minute.
thing, though, on the
No.
good
Susan, let's ask the Republican on the panel whether that's the case. Nicolee, Sam, it's Nicolee. Nicolee's the only Republican. She gets to answer this question.
Thank you, Casey. No, Republicans do not want mail-in balloting because we think it is ripe for corruption. We are very concerned about ballot harvesting. As has been widely demonstrated here in this state, we have concerns about how April was conducted. We have concerns about this June 2nd primary. And we want to do anything that ensures the integrity of every individual's vote. And we consider ballot harvesting a direct threat to that.
Nicolee, thank you. Now, everybody, I can't hear you because you're all talking at one time and Zoom is about to cut us off. Stay tuned for parting shots when we come back from this short break. And welcome back. Now with parting shots, Susan Heltemes.
Good things have come from this last week. The first is Ella Jones, first female and first Black mayor of Ferguson, Missouri, the home of Michael Brown, who was killed by police in 2014, was elected with 54%. On Tuesday night, 2 police officers were seen via video using excessive force in Prince George's County. Yesterday, the officers and their supervisor were suspended. And in Iowa, Steve King, the white supremacist and Republican congressman, was defeated in a primary. All good news.
Thank you, Susan. Now with parting shots, Mike Knapp.
Thank you so much. I just want to give a shout out to the students, the millennials, the Gen Zs, and all the peaceful protesters who are out there, because they're actually showing us how this should be done, and they're going to change the narrative and the dialogue that's going to occur for the next decade. And I'm just appreciative to their leadership under these difficult circumstances. And then also to our local law enforcement, in particular in Germantown, the 5D commander, Mark Blazinski, who showed, I think, how police can engage with the local population and really show how this can be done peacefully and constructively. And we had a great experience in Germantown on Sunday.
Thank you, Mike. Now with parting shots, Sam Statland.
My parting shot is directed at Linda Lamone, who should have graciously resigned way back in 2002, beginning with her terrible administration of the Diebold election system, going to the same issue we're now having with absentee ballots, where she and her office failed to follow up on a vendor to make sure that everybody's absentee ballot was mailed out on time. And then this latest fiasco where, again, because of their inability to enforce a contract, their inability to get the job done and follow up on a vendor, delayed this entire election. It's
Thank you, Sam.
time for Lamone to go.
Appreciate it, Sam. And parting shots, Nicolee Ambrose, lead us out of here.
So I want to give a shout out to Baltimore. Normally Baltimore gets such a bad rap, but we have had great peaceful protests here in Baltimore. I've been so proud of those protesters who have taken looters and rioters and handed them over to police to keep them from destroying our beautiful city up here in Baltimore. And I also want to give a shout out to our police commissioner, Michael Harrison, who took office last year and has been doing a really great job trying to bring people together and work with the community, between the police and community members, to make sure we keep Baltimore safe. So thank you to Team Baltimore.
Thank you, Nicolee, and thank you to the panel. Someday we may even have results from this past week's election, so we'll know who the new mayor of Baltimore is. I want to thank the panel for being here. These are fun meetings on unusual times and unusual events, and I think it's important that we keep up the political dialogue. And I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.